So how do you fit within the historiography? And once you have your own argument, you can start to think about all the historians you remember from the past four videos. So I've mentioned Clark and Pomeranz, but there's so many other historians. So as part of one of the quizzes for this, I'm going to be quizzing you on all the historians that we've looked at so far. And I've mentioned Clark and Pomeranz because they're quite different in the way that they're thinking. But also remember that historians love to argue with each other. So you can make a timeline and say, this is a historian that I agree with the least, this is a historian that I agree with the most. And maybe they'll have slightly different opinions. And annotate the timeline and explain why you disagree with the historian or why you agree with the historian, what you find super convincing about it or less convincing. Remember also that some historians are using the sources in a different way. So in the review article of Pomeranz, they explain that he is actually primarily looking at secondary sources, whereas someone like Nunn or historians working on the transatlantic slave trade have looked at extremely specific sources. So for example, ship data and different ethnicities of the African slaves on board. But they've also looked, for example, at weather patterns. So this is a chance of for you to recap everything that has been done before, but it's also a chance for you to come up with your own argument still because you already have your own argument, right? So you can actually start to see, oh, my argument, 50% of my argument is similar to what Pomeranz is saying about the Great Divergence. But then also you might end up thinking, actually, I only agree with 50% of what Pomeranz has said. And the other 50% I don't agree with, and this is why. And that kind of evaluative approach towards other historians, where you can talk about them critically, but also agree with them in some ways, is super, super important. And it's almost a cliche, but historians are considered to be some of the most argumentative academics. Bearing in mind, academia can be quite argumentative because all these people are disagreeing with each other on extremely niche things. There's even a book on the histories of arguments among historians. So having an idea of where you fit in, but also an idea of where you stand out and is a bit unique is important. So let's get into a bit more precisely the structure that you can follow. And this is going to be covering the introduction, the points, and the main body of the argument, and then the conclusion. So in your introduction, start with a quotation or anecdote if you can. Something interesting, something that fits in with the question title itself, and we'll have examples of that later on. And name 2 or 3 historians who have contradicting perspectives on this. So you could say something like, the question of economic growth has been discussed by historian Clark, by historians Clark, Pomeranz, and Nunn. And you could say something like, Clark has argued that the Malthusian trap was the primary reason why economic growth began in the late 18th century and why it was so rare before the time period, whereas other historians like Pomeranz have adopted a more ecological perspective on this. And this is really important, and this is what I've been recommended to do by my examiners and supervisors when I was in Cambridge, because it shows the person reading it directly that you're not just waffling, you know almost the landscape of the debate, and you're going to pop yourself right in the middle of the landscape and try to come up with something new. So don't pretend that what your argument is new, that no one else has done it before, but think about ways in which you could diverge a little bit from what they've said. Unless you manage to come up with something super unique that you can explain in 2,000 words. But since you probably have limited access to the source material, primary sources, that's much more difficult and probably not going to work as well as coming up with a nuanced take on someone else's argument that is actually more reflective of what you generally believe in.